He's become the first U.S. Secretary of State to visit Somalia. John Kerry has also been to Kenya and Djibouti discussing security and the fight against armed groups. But what about the economy and how important is Africa to the U.S.? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Fuli Batibo. Almost 2 years ago, President Barack Obama declared a new era in U.S. relations with Africa based on equal partnership as opposed to charitable aid. And now his Secretary of State, John Kerry, is on his second trip to Africa in just over a year, on a visit to Djibouti, Kenya, and an unannounced stop in Somalia. And one of the first things he talked about in Nairobi was a $45 million in aid designed to help fund better schools, clinics, and clean drinking water for refugees. Undoubtedly, money that will be well spent, but it points to a wider issue. How has the U.S. relationship with Africa changed in the Obama era? Well, that's our discussion today on Inside Story. But first, let's hear from Al Jazeera's Roslyn Jordan in Nairobi.
It was the first visit ever by a U.S. Secretary of State to Somalia. John Kerry's mission on Tuesday was to communicate the Obama administration's support for this fledgling democracy just 3 years old. As Somalia gets ready for parliamentary elections in 2016, the Secretary of State wanted to not only show the administration's support, but also to encourage Somalia to do more to try to improve its military capacity, particularly as it's trying to get rid of the terrorist group Al-Shabaab. Even though Somalia is working with members of AMISOM, other countries that have also pledged to use military force to try to degrade Al-Shabaab, they also have to deal with the fact that there is no long-term military tradition. And so Kerry wanted to underscore the U.S.'s willingness to help Somalia develop its military capacity. Finally, Kerry wanted to deliver the message that the rule of law and that free expression both are important in any democracy. And to that end, he made it a point of meeting with people who were very much instrumental in trying to make sure that Somalia has a healthy cultural environment, not just one that is a safe security environment.
Our guests today on Inside Story are Manji Cheto in London, Vice President of Teneo Intelligence. In Staunton, Virginia, in the United States, we have Kara Jones, who's Assistant Professor of Political Science at Mary Baldwin College. She's via Skype. And here in the studio in Doha, Afiare Elmi, Professor of International Affairs at Qatar University. Thank you all for being on Inside Story. Afiare Elmi, if I may start with you, an historic visit to Somalia by the U.S. Secretary of State today. It's just the latest twist in a very long and difficult history of U.S. involvement in Somalia, of course. My first question is, does the U.S. still matter today to Somalia?
Yes, it does, actually. And for Kerry's actually visit will have or will send three important messages. The first one is that it boosts the morale of the fledgling regime in Mogadishu, particularly what happened for the last while, repeated attacks by Al-Shabaab. I guess this time they needed a big political support, and Kerry provides that. So that's one. The second is that it sends a strong message to the region, particularly sub-region Ethiopia and Kenya, that no more Somalia will be just, appendix to these two countries. And if Somali leaders are to be met, they have to be flown to Addis Ababa and Nairobi. I think that also has ended, and that's a good thing for Somalia. I guess this too comes despite the poor performance of the regime in Mogadishu, and still it shows that the Americans have no alternative but to deal with that weak institution that has been struggling for the last 10 years.
Kara Jones in Staunton, the battle for Mogadishu and the downing of the Black Hawk in Somalia 22 years ago, of course, undoubtedly had an impact on U.S. foreign policy, especially in Africa. What message do you think this visit by the Secretary of State to Mogadishu sends today? What does it mean?
Well, the larger message about Kerry's visit to both Kenya and Somalia is that we will support political change and political stability in Africa. And especially in regions of concern, we will do all that we can, at least politically, and in form of offering verbal support for fledgling regimes, for institutions that may be able to help us. And of course, there's also a security dimension in this. I mean, let's not forget that Somalia and Kenya and the broader region of the Horn are where we've been focusing our efforts, our military efforts, to counter terrorism in that region.
Manji, there are many who say that America's priorities in Africa are too often concerned with terrorism, security, or Ebola, and not with the economy. What about the economy, they ask?
You know, it depends on the way that you look at it. I mean, if you look at it in terms of the data, the hardcore data on US trade and investment in Africa, it's actually showing a complete opposite. It's showing that the US relations with Africa has still not changed dramatically. I mean, US trade with Africa at the moment is sitting around kind of $85 billion. I mean, if you compare that to the US biggest rival in Africa, China, that's $210 billion. So I think certainly when you look at the facts, I mean, I think people would still argue, and I think rightly so, that the US has not yet seen Africa as an economic priority.
Well, I do want to focus on the economy and trade relations a bit more a little later in the program. I want to come back to the security issue, Afiare Elmi. The Black Hawk Down incident in Somalia 22 years ago, many would argue had an impact, of course, on extremists who took advantage of the U.S. withdrawal. The lawlessness that followed the American exit created a breeding ground for terrorist groups, so-called terrorist groups like Al-Shabaab, who are operating in that region today. How do you see the U.S. engaging differently in Somalia and in the Horn of Africa in general today?
Well, the basic principles that inform U.S. policy towards Somalia have not changed since 9/11. And there were three, basically: remove terrorism, and then the second was contain the Somalia problem within its borders so that it does not go beyond, either to Kenya and Ethiopia.
But it has.
And it has, in fact, gone. And the third one was address the governance challenges, and it has not. So these were the three principles that informed the policy towards the Somalia. And whether those were successful or not, to my view, it was not. And I have published it and I'm on record on that. With respect to the Al-Shabaab and how it's being handled and how it's being viewed, I think the time has come where we need to really visit the strategy desk and see what has not worked. In my view, the state, Al-Shabaab, is only as strong as the state is weak. And what we see now is in Mogadishu, and particularly the Somali state, it's too weak to take the responsibility of the state. And that is the problem, and that has not been invested so far. All the functions of the Somali state have been outsourced to other actors, whether that is the region or AMISOM or the international organizations or anyone else. So technically, the Somali state does not exist. And unless we have a state, we cannot fight or we cannot win against the Al-Shabaab.
Well, Kerry's visit to Nairobi is seen by many as an attempt by the U.S. to mend its frayed ties with Kenya. The relationship became strained after President Uhuru Kenyatta's election in 2013, a man who was charged with crimes against humanity by the International Criminal Court, charges that were later dropped. But the U.S. has increased its cooperation with Kenya in recent years, specifically providing it with military assistance to fight Al-Shabaab. But Kerry made it clear during this visit that he believes that that fight against Al-Shabaab should stay within the rule of law and not collectively punish all Somalis. So, Kara Jones, the U.S. has tried in general to pin its policies in Africa to democratic development, of course, and the respect for human rights, as we saw Kerry say in Kenya. But how does the Obama administration match this rhetoric? We've heard the president say this time and time again during his visits to Ghana, for instance. How do they match this rhetoric with policy implementation? Because for the moment, there hasn't been really a great deal of an improvement when it comes to human rights on the African continent.
We've actually tried to go about this in a fairly interesting and novel way. So one of the things that the U.S. government is really trying to push is professionalization of the African militaries that we work with in order to try and improve human rights records, in order to try and improve violence against civilians, and in order to really push forward this idea that the Army can be an institution that protects civilians and protects constitutional rights and protects human development, instead of what we typically tend to think the African military is, which might be one of the biggest human rights violators on the continent. So we've really been trying to push this idea of professionalization through the military, not just through AFRICOM and our relationships that way, but also in support services to militaries across the continent.
You mentioned the professionalization of the African military, and I do want to talk about that military aspect. The U.S. has, of course, been increasing its military footprint across Africa, and Nick Turse has tracked that expansion, and he found that the U.S. carried out some 674 different types of military activity across Africa last year, nearly 2 missions a day. That's an almost 300% jump since 2008, when U.S. Africa Command, or AFRICOM, was set up. Now, those military activities include everything from bilateral training exercises to covert operations. So let me ask Afiare here in Doha about this idea of professionalizing the African militaries that the U.S. has been involved with. Do you think that's changed anything? Have we seen really a real push when it comes to human rights and the rule of law on the African continent?
Well, in terms of Somalia, when we look back, at least what happened for the last 3 or 4 years, the U.S. trained at least 1 battalion, which is considered one of the good ones in the country at the moment, and professional in the sense that they can automatically go and end where an attack is taking place by Al-Shabaab. When it comes to human rights and civilian, I mean taking care of the civilians and all of these things, I think not only Somalis, but even AMISOM and the neighboring countries, troops have committed heinous crimes against civilians in Somalia, and I don't think there is a lot that we can be proud of at the moment.
Yeah, but how do the U.S. with its military presence, as we've seen on the African continent, how do they play a role in changing this?
Well, at the moment, it seems that they are bypassing both AMISOM and the neighboring countries and directly trying to train. They have done one, and they are trying to do at least 1 or 2 based on the information I'm getting from the Somali government. But if that is what is happening, it's still too little, too late in terms of the challenge that security challenge that the country is facing. In terms of the continent as a whole, I think the sub-region, when we're talking about in the East Africa, we are only talking about Kenya and Tanzania. The rest are basically authoritarian or semi-authoritarian regimes, and in that I don't think there is much of human rights that they can claim. And Washington, being as it was, it always prefers security over anything else. And that's what was happening.
Kara, do you agree with that? Security over everything else. And, how does Washington play a role in improving human rights on the continent?
I both agree and disagree. I do agree that the U.S. and especially the Obama administration's priorities are definitely security first. Mm-hmm. And whether we define this as terrorism or whether we define this as other security against other types of political violence, I do think that the Obama administration's priority is definitely security first. However, I disagree. I think that there are some cases where the U.S. has contributed greatly to professionalization of the military where things are going really well. Let's just take a look at Burundi, where basically the army, which has been trained by the U.S. and other partner organizations...
But things aren't really going well right now in Burundi, Kara, are they?
No, but the army is standing in between the police and the protesters, and they're actually protecting the protesters. The army is doing exactly what it's supposed to, which is respecting the rule of law, protecting civilians, and standing in basically the army is the strongest institution in that state right now. So right. Yes, it's a success because Burundi is exploding, but it is a success in terms of the army is doing its job instead of, when you see the army in other cases, actually committing human rights violations against civilians.
Manji, I do want to get your point on this. I know your focus is, of course, the economy and trade. We'll get to that in just a second. But on this idea of the U.S. playing a more active role in preventing human rights abuses on the African continent, professionalizing the military and so on. Do you think there has been an improvement since the Obama administration has been in power?
Again, I don't think that there is enough empirical evidence to point to in that direction. I mean, I think that, yes, Kara is right. The Burundian military has, in a way, stepped to be the kind of intermediary here with the conflict in Burundi. However, there is a split in the military. So, I mean, if we're looking at that and saying that that's, a success of kind of U.S. military training in Africa, then I'm not sure that we're quite at the point. Mm-hmm. I mean, it certainly is going in the right direction, but I'm not sure it's quite there. But I think ultimately, the U.S. will prioritize security over anything else. I mean, there are loads of other countries where the U.S. has actually trained local military, and the military still remains fairly unprofessional under human rights abuses. I mean, I can certainly point to a country like Nigeria. Very recently, we know that there's been a spat between the Nigerian government and the U.S. government over claims by the U.S. government of human rights abuses by the Nigerian military. And I think the Nigerian government's response has been, well, you're not in a position to speak to us about these issues, considering that the U.S. military in security situations has behaved in a way with the same allegations that the U.S. government is pointing at the Nigerian military. So, I mean, I think, a very, very touchy relationship, and I'm not quite sure that it's as straightforward or as black and white as, the U.S. government would probably like us to believe.
All right, security first, but what about the economy? Well, since the year 2000, U.S. trade relations with Africa have been governed by the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. It was meant to increase trade between the U.S. and the African continent. But a look at the statistics from the last 5 years show a very different picture. The value of U.S.-African trade has actually decreased since 2011 from over $125 billion in 2011 to just $72 billion last year. Now, none of this is good news for the U.S., especially at a time when Chinese trade with Africa has risen rapidly. Manji, in London, I do want to ask you about AGOA, which was touted as the next big thing in U.S.-Africa relations. But how has AGOA benefited the African continent?
I mean, I think AGOA on paper, let's be clear, has been very significant for Africa, and also it has been significant for particularly the smaller African countries who have benefited from at least having a market compared to not having a market at all that they could export their goods. But broadly, if you look at the data on AGOA, the three countries that have actually benefited most significantly is actually Nigeria, Angola, and South Africa. Mm-hmm. For Nigeria and Angola, it wouldn't surprise a lot of people that actually a lot of the exports from these two countries have been oil. So when you look at the data around kind of 2011, and particularly also from 2008, 2009, and you start to look at the decline in US-Africa trade, a lot of that is a reflection of the global economic crisis, and also the US demand for African oil was starting to go down. And that's a reflection of the discrepancy, I think, in AGOA. So once, even though on paper it was meant to kind of expand market access for African countries, in reality hasn't actually done so. It's benefited largely the bigger countries, and mainly actually oil exports.
So it hasn't been a success all over for the African continent. Afiare, we mentioned China, and with China's rising influence today, do you think the U.S. still matters for Africa from an economic point of view?
Well, it does, simply because U.S. emphasizes security, and it invests a lot of money, much more money than China spends on security, which means when you have security apparatus on the ground, you have an influence of the economic policy. And what has been happening for at least many countries in East Africa is that whenever the Chinese or anybody else is interested to negotiate a deal in relation to oil or anything or natural resources, the governments cannot dare to do that, simply because either there was some form of concession signed with American oil company, or it's an area that the regimes, even as weak as Somalia, are very much, they know the red line, where the red line is, and where they can go and where they cannot go. And I guess this is a very important factor for the America's economic interests and geostrategic issues for that matter. With respect to China, I think one good thing is that it doesn't emphasize anything other than economy. It basically
well, some people would say that's not necessarily a good thing, that it would be actually good to put some conditions, as some European countries, as the US does, when it comes to business.
I think it's good in the sense that if the life of the people is improved, or at least, the economic performance in general is better, then it's good for everybody. And when you look at Eastern Africa, like 8 or 9 countries, and you have only 2 democracies and one is extremely insecure, well, you see the majority of the population here you are dealing with is run or governed by the dictators and authoritarian regimes. So what else can you expect? China is exploiting that fact, but still, even that, there is a limitation. The second, I think, advantage is China focuses on infrastructure projects where the United States is not largely seen in doing something along that line. And I think Turkey just stepped in. And if you look at in Somalia, for instance, Turkey was doing much better in terms of at least the general perception of the people when you compare to both.
Indeed, there is a growing Turkish presence in Somalia. Yep. Kara, in Staunton, China, is often criticized for what looks like an unfair strategy when engaging Africa, and critics claim that the Chinese strategy is more about exploiting African natural resources, of course, than spurring the continent's development. But I wonder, is the U.S. strategy more transparent? Is it more clear?
Well, I don't know about that, but let's be clear here, right? The U.S. and both when we talk about U.S.-China, these relationships are not monolithic, and these actors aren't either. So when we talk about China, are we speaking about the Chinese state? Are we speaking about Chinese parastatals who may or may not be private? Or are we speaking about individual Chinese investors who are going into Africa as a market? The same is true for U.S. interests. These things are simply not monolithic. So if we're going to talk about, a new Cold War between the U.S. and China and Africa, I think that's a mistake, and I think we need to unpack who's doing what, for what reasons, and why. These are often very different things. Yes, the U.S. government imposes a lot of conditions on their aid, whereas aid from the Chinese government does not always carry those conditions. The Chinese government has in recent years embraced more infrastructure projects, embraced more things that on their face might seem to contribute to human development more in Africa than some U.S. projects. That being said, it's really unclear where the line is between Chinese private investors, Chinese parastatals, and the Chinese government. So again, who's doing what and for what reason is a question that we need to ask of any project.
Kara, briefly, there are many people who've said that George W. Bush was a better friend to Africa than Barack Obama is currently, that he did more for Africa than President Barack Obama. Do you agree with that?
I actually do. I have said this before to my students. So when you look at the body of evidence, especially surrounding PEPFAR, this has been a far more successful implementation of U.S. government goals towards Africa. Whereas with the Obama administration, you actually have this return to this militarized and security-heavy relationship, which I don't know if it's ultimately going to help the people on the continent much more than anything else.
Manji, it seems that the question today is, how do you find the right balance between security, between building drone bases in Africa and business?
Well, I think, at the end of the day, what has been so different about, or what has been quite problematic, I should say, about the US-Africa relations is that the US has traditionally treated Africa in such a patriarchal kind of relationship. And I think the important thing here that African governments are saying is they want a partnership. They want to be treated as equals. Now, of course, what the US can offer compared to what Africa can offer the US is very different. But I think it's important for African governments for them to be recognized as partners. And I think that hasn't actually changed, be it a Bush administration or an Obama administration. The relationship has always sort of seemed to be a US lecturing Africa. And I think part of the important thing about China coming into this relationship is it's kind of increased Africa's confidence in its own ability to sort of put its foot down and say that we will actually pick our own partners. And I think that's the most important thing for the US to recognize, and also for China to recognize, or any other another new partner coming into Africa. African governments are tired, and the African people are tired of as being treated as infants effectively, and they want to be treated in true partnership.
Thank you so much for a very interesting discussion. Thank you for your thoughts. Manji Cheto in London, Cara Jones in Staunton, and Afiare Elme here in Doha with me. And thank you as well for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. As always, we'd love to hear your thoughts. You can get in touch with us on our program page at aljazeera.com. You can also post your comments at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story or tweet us at AJ Inside Story. From me, Fuli Batibo, and the whole team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.